Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Friday the 13th of October. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. This evening, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 597 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition, and I will then bring you the latest from Israel and Gaza. Then I'll introduce our guest for this evening, and then together we'll take a look at a headline and then discuss the weekend's events in Scotland and around the world. Russian and Ukrainian forces fought fierce battles around the eastern Ukrainian town of Avdiivka after Moscow launched one of its biggest military offensives in months this week. President Volodymyr Zelensky said Ukrainian forces were holding their ground in the third day of battle, but municipal officials said the Russian attacks were relentless. Finland has said that it could not exclude the possibility that a state actor was behind the damage to a gas pipeline under the Baltic Sea, amid what its National Security Intelligence Service called significantly deteriorated relations with Russia. The US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, said yesterday that the US would support Finland and Estonia as they probe the damage to the Baltic Connector pipeline and the parallel Estlink telecommunications cable between the two countries. Yesterday, the International Olympic Committee suspended the Russian Olympic Committee for recognizing regional organizations from 4 territories annexed from Ukraine. Ukraine claims it has thwarted an overnight attempt by a Russian saboteur group to cross its northeastern border in the Sumy region. Serhiy Nayev, the commander of Joint Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, said yesterday. The Russian President, Vladimir Putin, has said he expects military and defense cooperation with Kyrgyzstan to expand during a visit to a Russian airbase near the Kyrgyz capital, Bishkek. French prosecutors have opened an investigation into the possible poisoning of Marina Ovsyanovnikova, the exiled Russian journalist who staged a high-profile protest against the war in Ukraine. Yesterday, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe recognised the 1932-33 Holodomor starvation of millions in Ukraine under the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin as a genocide. Yesterday, Romanian authorities said they had found a crater from a suspected drone that may have exploded on impact on its territory near the border with Ukraine, reviving concerns about possible spillover of Russia's war in Ukraine onto a NATO member's territory. US military officials displayed what they said were pieces of Iranian drones recovered in Ukraine to UN member states as evidence of the growing ties between Iran and Russia. The UN Human Rights Council has extended the mandate of Mariana Katsarova, its rapporteur on rights violations in Russia, by a year, in a second diplomatic defeat for Moscow in 3 days. And the journalist Keybar Akifi was severely wounded in a drone attack that also killed his 4-year-old daughter and his wife's parents in Russia's border region of Belgorod, several media officials have said. And from Israel and Gaza, Israel's military has told 1.1 million residents of northern Gaza to relocate further south within 24 hours. The UN has warned that it would be impossible for such a movement to take place without devastating humanitarian consequences. Stefan Dujarric, spokesperson for the UN Secretary-General, said that UN officials had been told that the entire population of Gaza north of Wadi Gaza should relocate to southern Gaza within the next 24 hours. The order sent panic through civilians and aid workers already struggling under Israeli airstrikes and a blockade. The UN Humanitarian Office, the OCHA, said early on Friday that more than 400,000 people had already fled their homes in the Gaza Strip. It said 23 aid workers had been killed since the start of the Israeli retaliatory strikes in response to the Hamas attack on Saturday. Israel's ambassador to the UN, Gilad Erdan, said the UN's response was shameful and that it should focus on condemning Hamas and supporting Israel's right to self-defence. The UK Defence Secretary, Grant Shapps, has said that the UK supported the decision of the IDF to give advance notice that it is intending to mount an attack. The World Health Organization has said asking vulnerable patients to evacuate hospitals in Gaza amounted to a death sentence, and the Director General of the agency, Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, called upon Israel to reverse its decision to order an evacuation. Hamas has urged people to stay put and defy the order to evacuate their homes. Ayad al-Bozom, spokesperson for the Hamas Interior Ministry, said, "We tell the people of northern Gaza and from Gaza City, stay put in your homes and your places. By carrying out massacres against the civilians, the occupation wants to displace us once again from our land. The 1948 displacement will not happen. We will die and we will not leave." Hamas has claimed to have launched 150 rockets towards the city of Ashkelon in Israel in response to the displacement and targeting of civilians. Hamas's armed wing, the Al-Qassam Brigades, said in a statement that 13 captives were killed in Israeli strikes on Gaza in the last 24 hours. It's unclear exactly how many Israeli hostages Hamas took when it carried out its incursion into Israel's territory on Saturday. The most recent official death toll from Israel stands at 1,300. Israel's military spokesperson said the government has been able to confirm the identities of 97 people taken hostage into Gaza, but more than 100 are believed to have been taken. More than 1,500 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli strikes since Saturday, Gaza's health ministry said yesterday. Among them are 500 children. A further 6,612 are wounded in Israeli airstrikes in the Palestinian enclave, the ministry said. Israel began the process of burying the victims of the weekend's attacks by Hamas. The majority of the dead were killed in a single day when Hamas fighters broke through the border and attacked Israel. 222 who have been killed since the attacks began on Saturday are soldiers, the military said. Iran's foreign minister, Hossein Amir-Abdollahian, warned that if Israel's attacks on the Gaza Strip don't stop immediately, the violence could spread to other parts of the Middle East. Jordan's King Abdullah II has met the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. In a message posted to social media, the king warned against any attempt to forcibly displace Palestinians from all Palestinian territories or cause their internal displacement, and he called for the prevention of a spillover of the crisis into neighbouring countries. The European Parliament President Roberta Metsola and the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen have landed in Israel. The Italian Foreign Minister Antonio Tajani has also confirmed that he has arrived there. The US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has also arrived in the country for high-level meetings. And Human Rights Watch said that it had concluded Israel used white phosphorus in military operations over the Gaza City port and at two rural locations along the Israel-Lebanon border this week. Israel's use of white phosphorus in crowded civilian areas poses a high risk of excruciating burns and lifelong suffering, the organisation warned. Now, we are lucky enough to be joined this evening by Maureen Watt, who's a retired politician and a former Minister for Mental Health in our Scottish Government. Maureen served as a regional MSP for North East Scotland from 2006 until 2011 and was then the member of our Scottish Parliament representing the constituency of Aberdeen South and North Kincardine from 2011 until 2021 when Maureen retired. Maureen, good evening. How are you keeping?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. Yes, very windy here this evening though. But hopefully no trees
I
come
can hear
down.
it. Can hear it. But yes, it's lovely to see you, and thank you for joining us this evening on Broadcasting Scotland. It struck me when I was reading out the Ukraine update that it's very nearly 600 days since Ukraine was invaded. We're at day 597 today, and it looks like a second winter of war is nearly here. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were about the current situation regarding the status of Ukraine and the people of Ukraine.
My biggest worry is that it falls off the agenda and minds of people because of the situation in the Middle East and that the people of Ukraine and President Zelensky begin to feel that they're on their own. And clearly, I think this is one of the things that will be in Putin's mind as well, maybe along with Iran. He has introduced another front, if you like, in his war against what he perceives as the West, and to create chaos in the world, which he thinks is to Russia and his allies' advantage. So it's a very depressing state to be in, and I hope that's not going to be the case. But I think the international leaders, and there are plenty of them, need to make sure that Ukraine does not fall off the agenda or fall behind with the new crisis in the Middle East.
Absolutely, and I was also going to ask you about that, Maureen. The news is developing very quickly, and there's obviously a worldwide horror and revulsion at the loss of life and the situation of civilians, both Israeli and Palestinian. And I was wondering, what are your reflections on the events that we've been seeing unfolding since the shock attack last Saturday?
Yeah, it is really horrifying and unexpected, not just to the world, but obviously to the Israelis as well. I mean, I thought, as did many, that Israeli intelligence was really tip top, and clearly, although I did hear that it wasn't under Mossad's responsibility, that uh, their their defences have failed on this occasion, and the ferocity with which the attack happened is really absolutely mortifying. And now we're seeing the consequences, really, of an all-out war in the Middle East between Israel and the Palestinians on the Gaza Strip, with weapons coming in from all sorts of places. So I think, we've heard that Antony Blinken has been there, and you mentioned various international leaders going there. I think that international leaders really have to get the two sides in different rooms in the same place and really hammer it out, so that at least there can be a ceasefire, because otherwise it is really going to be, if the Israelis are left to what they've said they want to do, which is clear Gaza, I think it's going to be an absolute bloodbath that just doesn't bear thinking about.
Thanks, Maureen. Yes, I think it's fair to say that everybody's holding their breaths, waiting to see how it unfolds, and hoping that the bloodbath that you're talking about does not unfold. But we will just have to, where we are here, we'll have to wait and see, I'm afraid. Let's move on now. There's one story I'm going to talk to you about this evening, and that is that Labour's Shadow Scotland Secretary, Ian Murray MP, has said that he does not support any further powers being devolved to Scotland. In an interview in the Daily Record, Mr Murray confirmed that a Labour UK government would not devolve further powers to Holyrood, such as employment law, despite Anna Sarwar and Scottish Labour claiming to be in favour of devolving these matters to Holyrood. Ian Murray has also said that he would not rule out further use of Section 35 powers by the UK government to veto laws that have been passed by a majority in the democratically elected Scottish Parliament. The SNP MSP Colette Stevenson has called on Anna Sarwar to stand up against his Westminster bosses and show he is truly committed to protecting devolution and delivering the further powers to Holyrood he has promised voters across Scotland. Commenting, the SNP MSP Colette Stevenson said, "We've seen the Tories repeatedly attempt to undermine the future of the Scottish Parliament, and we expect it from them, but to have Labour now confessing to it is staggering. Anna Sarwar and his Scottish Labour MSPs have promised people across the country that Labour will empower Holyrood to legislate on vital areas such as employment law. It is crucial he now comes out and opposes these comments from his Westminster bosses." She went on, "Power over employment laws would allow the Scottish Parliament to increase the national minimum wages, extend sick pay, and ban fire and rehire. For Labour to be against those questions, whether they are really a party of working people. So, Maureen, so Anas Sarwar says he wants more powers devolved to Holyrood, but Ian Murray says he doesn't. Who do you think's in charge of the British Labour Party in Scotland, and who between those two characters should we believe?
Well, I don't think we should believe either of them because they don't seem to know what the latest pronouncement from Keir Starmer on this, if there has been, is correct. So obviously they're not even on the same page on this or anything else that we can see. But clearly, both rely on waiting for their pronouncement, as say from their leader Keir Starmer, and clearly the Labour group, which is now what you call to a group, the couple in Westminster, are trying to assert their authority, whatever that might be. And Anas Sarwar always seems to be on the back foot. I think his instincts are to see Holyrood strengthened, but he's getting pushed back, I think, every time from Westminster. So what we're clearly seeing is little difference between red Tories and blue Tories, who both want to curtail the devolved powers to the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament. I mean, my view is that they see that devolved government works. They can see that we can make different decisions, pass different laws within our devolved competence that makes things work differently in Scotland, whether it be no tuition fees, no prescriptions, introducing the baby box, managing or trying to mitigate some of the worst excesses of Westminster rule in terms of child poverty and helping those worst off in our society. And they don't like it. It's because they see it as losing control from Westminster, forgetting, of course, that the UK is still one of the most centralised countries in the world. So I would want to say that the Westminster election is shaping up to be something interesting, but because Labour and Tories are so much on the same page, it's not going to be that interesting in from that point of view in Scotland. And we hope after this weekend that the SNP will set out precisely how they see the territory on which the forthcoming election will be fought.
Thanks, Maureen. Yes, you mentioned the group of two, and of course I'm reminded now that Scotland now has as many Labour MPs as it has giant pandas, which is perhaps tells us something. But I was going to ask you, why would devolving employment law now be a problem for Westminster? Plenty of things related to employment are already devolved, and the majority of Scots work in sectors which are devolved, like health, social care, and education.
Yes, so in a previous life, I did work in HR, and I'm currently helping a friend with an employment tribunal case. And my goodness, the legislation is so out of date, and I hadn't realised till now. So desperately needs updating. But yes, you're right that we do have a large public sector in Scotland, and that is devolved. And also, with the national minimum wage coming under that would make such a huge difference if we could increase the minimum wage. It would, hopefully negate the need for food banks, and people would be able to rely on a decent income. I mean, I think that could be really game changing. So that's probably why they don't want it devolved. As I said, we can show that we can do, where we do have powers over legislation and areas of government, we can be seen to make a difference. And clearly they wouldn't want that to happen in Scotland, would they?
Clearly, absolutely, Maureen. Thank you. Now, the rest of this evening's programme, we're going to discuss the SNP's party conference, their annual party conference, which is in Aberdeen this weekend on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. Broadcasting Scotland will be there and will be reporting regularly throughout the conference. So please watch social media, and you'll see us coming back online and talking to those who are attending the conference. I'm keen to have a conversation with Maureen about a number of the important resolutions which the conference will discuss and debate, and we'll have a look at a number of those. There are a great deal of resolutions, and there'll be a great deal of other business, but there were a number of ones that stood out to me, and I'm keen to talk to Maureen about them and to get her thoughts on that. So, Maureen, probably the centrepiece of the resolutions at conference this weekend is the resolution on independence strategy, which is in the name of Humza Yousaf and Stephen Flynn, the SNP's leader at Westminster. And I won't read, and I'm not going to read the whole resolutions in any of these ones, but I'll read the first three paragraphs in order that we can get a flavour of what it is that the resolution is about. So, on independence strategy, the resolution says, Conference believes that the next UK general election should be used as an opportunity to advance the cause of independence and to demonstrate how the powers of independence would enable us to take action on Scotland's priorities, from tackling the Westminster-made cost of living crisis to protecting our public services, eradicating poverty, and building a fairer economy that works for us all. It goes on, Conference believes that Scotland is facing a cost of Westminster crisis, one that is making life increasingly challenging for people across the country and makes the case for independence even more urgent. Conference notes that the UK government continues to unjustly block a democratic referendum, thereby denying the people of Scotland the opportunity to express their support for independence. Now, as you would expect for such a high-profile resolution, there are no fewer than 7 amendments proposed. One with regard to a definition of the transfer of powers in the name of Tommy Shepherd, Stuart MacDonald, Richard Thompson, Alan Smith, Anne McLaughlin, Philippa Whitford, Dave Duggan, and a number of branches. An amendment by under the name of Tony Giuliano, which refers to a renewed independence campaign, and an amendment in the name of Joanna Cherry MP, which talks about the establishment and the meeting of a constitutional convention. So, Maureen, I was struck that the opening language in the resolution is very much about the purpose of independence, but inevitably an independence strategy discussion then begins to focus very much on the process of independence rather than the purpose. So do you think, will it be possible to get, well, do you think those two things should be balanced, and do you think it'll be possible to get an appropriate balance between those two component parts in the course of the debate tomorrow?
So it's Sunday, I think. Conference is Sunday,
Sunday.
Monday, and Tuesday, not Saturday,
Yes.
Sunday, and Mondays. Yes,
Yes.
Just in case people are looking for some coverage of it. It's not on Saturday; it's Sunday. So, and this resolution is to be debated on Sunday afternoon.
Yep.
So clearly, because the Westminster government has denied us a referendum, we have to find other ways to get our independence, which is the SNP's key priority. And to me, who's been in the party for 50 years next year, this was always, for many, many years, the way that we said we would go for independence, to get the most number of SNP MPs from Scotland to Westminster, and that would be the basis for negotiation. So because the UK government says that they are not going to let us use the referendum method, this is the only other way in order to democratically get our independence. So that is what the resolution, with its 6 paragraphs, is designed to do. I think it's a well-written resolution. I think it's been very carefully thought out, and I think I'm not sure I'm answering your original question, Andrew, but I think
okay.
the amendments in every which way dilute the main message. So when we had a long discussion last Saturday at our constituency meeting, that was the conclusion after very interesting debate and lots of contributions from the floor. That was the agreement that we reached, that we would support the main resolution and none of the amendments, because we felt that it diluted the main message of these 6 points. So I think the first one that you mentioned, you'll note that it is, I'm just scrolling on it now, that there are a number of MPs, all MPs, not MSPs, who have put forward this amendment, and it talks about giving the Scottish Parliament some more powers, not all of the powers. So that in itself dilutes it, and I wonder if they're thinking about keeping their jobs, which is not what we sent them there to do.
Absolutely, Maureen. That's very useful perspective, historical perspective, to which I'm very grateful, and also an interesting reflection on the presentation of the resolution and the presentation of the strategy. It might be said that we live in a time, a political time in the UK just now, where everything has to be reduced to three-word phrases, which are then repeated ad infinitum to try and drive home that message. And do you think the resolution and the strategy it embodies, that it can be it's strong enough to, firstly, on the one hand, be simplified further and not diluted, in order that it's very clear, but also that it can support the debate and some of the complexities, which undoubtedly will enter into the public political discussion round about this strategy?
That's a big question. I think the fact that the cost of Westminster crisis is a phrase that is now being used, I think that's interesting. And clearly, I think it's being tested as to see what the reaction is to that. But you cannot just talk about a cost of Westminster crisis without saying what the way of tackling that is. Now, clearly, since Hamza became leader, we've talked about how independence is the answer. Now we need to flesh that out, but clearly independence and talking about a fairer economy and all that entails is really important to flesh out between now and whenever the election is. But I think this is certainly something which I hope we can build on. I mean, I think, as I said, I think it'd be a shame if some of these amendments pass, because I think it waters down the main message. But then, of course, once the amendments are dealt with, there will be a for and against the resolution. And it'll be interesting to see what the debate is there and how conference decides on this. But my sincere hope is that, as I say, it's passed without amendment, passed by a big majority, if not unanimously, and that the party can unite behind that. And then we go on to talk about how we need a fairer economy in an independent Scotland, and that independence is the answer to the Westminster crisis.
Thanks, Maureen. That's a great input and great insight into the events that we're expecting to see unfolding over the weekend. Thank you. Now, having looked at the centrepiece resolution, I thought it would be worthwhile having a look at a small number of the other resolutions that will be debated, in order to get your thoughts on them. And some of them in particular cover areas in which you've got a great deal of relevant experience. But the first one I wanted to talk about is a resolution also on Sunday, which is in the name of Chris Law MP and a great friend to Broadcasting Scotland, Councillor Siobhan Tolland, amongst others. And it's on bringing energy resources into public control. And the first three paragraphs of that, the first paragraphs of that resolution read: "Conference recognises that the last winter crisis was caused by Westminster's refusal to provide appropriate support and reckless economics in the escalating and unaffordable increase in energy prices. The SNP recognises that this crisis is one that can be prevented, but that the current Westminster government's intervention is woefully inadequate. This crisis is a humanitarian disaster and a public health tragedy, and Conference is grateful to the Scottish Government for its humane approach to these events. Conference calls on the SNP to plan for an independent Scotland to bring our energy resources into public control and to commit to building the infrastructure for this as soon as practically possible." And it struck me, Maureen, that in this context, we know that both Scotland and Norway discovered oil, and Norway now has a more than £2 trillion sovereign fund, and Scotland has food banks. And an energy cost crisis. So, do you think the resolution in the name of Chris Law and Siobhan Toland to nationalise energy resources is likely to be supported at conference this weekend?
Yes, I'm not sure I can call this one at all. Clearly the sentiment behind it is absolutely one that I would support. And, in Scotland, we now have we've always had a nationalised water, and water has always been nationalised, thank goodness, thank God for that, given what's happening down south, and it's been pillaged in the name of taking out profits for the high-paid executives and shareholders. So thank God we've got a national water company. And the railways have now been nationalised in Scotland, which is absolutely great, and things are beginning to change there, as we've seen by fares being the fares being the same throughout the day, and not having higher ones at commuting times and things like that. So whether we could nationalise it in one go, I'm not sure, but surely we could take a stake in it. And if we can't take a stake in it, we could surely, as you pointed out, have an oil fund from the profits of the oil and gas that is ours. I mean, we're a country which is hugely energy rich, but fuel poor. So we have got to find a way of changing that completely, so that the people of Scotland benefit from the riches of Scotland, and that's clearly not happening. So I'm interested in seeing what the arguments are on this. I'm not sure if there are amendments to this. I'm not sure, but clearly there is always the voting for the resolution, voting against the resolution, or before that, remitting the resolution back for something else to come in its place. So I absolutely agree with the sentiment of the resolution. Whether it's practical, I'm not sure. I'm always conscious, having been in the party, as I said, for nearly 50 years, but having been in Parliament for 15 years and a minister for nearly 5 of those years, how conference resolutions cannot always be lifted straight from conference into government policy. And I would want to see if there's a routes to make something possible for a government, an independent Scotland. We could say we're starting from day one and nationalising, but I always am thinking, what are the costs of something like this? So, and the practicalities of it.
Of course. Thank you, Maureen. That's great insight as well, in particular the practicalities of, as you say, cutting and pasting resolutions into government policy. I wanted to look at another resolution with you because there's a resolution in the name of Stuart MacDonald MP and Alison Thewlis MP and a branch under the title "A Humane and Just Asylum System." Now, earlier this week on Broadcasting Scotland, we were talking about the effect of the rising interest rates on the cost of the cost for countries in Africa in particular servicing their debts, and how more than half of all public spending in some countries goes on servicing debt interest. And then of course we have had the events over the weekend, and the point is that the impact of those increased interest rates means that people are leaving these countries because the services there are struggling because the money is going on debt interest instead, and so it is having the effect of increasing migration. And then, of course, we have the events unfolding in Israel and Gaza, which I think it's likely to say that in due course will lead to further increased migration. So the resolution in the name of Stuart MacDonald and Alison Thulis says, Conference believes that Scotland must strive to be a welcoming and inclusive country, and we should value everyone, no matter their birthplace, who has chosen to make Scotland their home and to live, work, study, raise their families and build their lives. Conference considers the UK government's Illegal Migration Act to be dehumanising, immoral and in breach of the UK's obligations under the 1951 Refugee Convention, the European Convention on Human Rights, the European Convention on Action Against Trafficking and the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and rejects the deeply damaging hostile environment policy pursued by successive Conservative governments in Westminster. So, whilst migration has been a touchstone for right-wing politics, in particular in England, do you think that this resolution would similarly operate as a beacon or as a hallmark of the different approach that the SNP wishes to take to asylum and migration more generally?
Yeah, that's what my answer was going to be, that we need to reassert, and Conference is a great platform for this, to reassert how the SNP views the world differently from virtually every Westminster party, and certainly the two main parties who are appealing to the lowest common denominator in terms of using world crises as a way of shutting up shop, if you like, in the UK, and creating borders and walls between us and the rest of the world. Whereas, on the other hand, the SNP and its outlook and its view of an independent Scotland is one of an outward-looking, international, always having a place for those fleeing from conflict and persecution. And let's not forget that Scotland is not full up in any way. Scotland was progressing and becoming more wealthy as more people came to contribute to our society and contribute in taxes and contribute to the GDP of Scotland. And that is being eroded by Westminster's dreadful immigration policies. In terms of internationally and debt, which you mentioned, and debt that African countries are having to pay, that's always been a problem, and it seems to rack up. But in the meantime, you've also got the other side of the coin, where many of the resources, whether it be oil, whether it be gold, whether it be lithium, are being raped, and I use that word deliberately, by Western countries. So they're taking away any resources that they could get income from, and it's not being used to pay off their debt and use them to get their economies in a balance where their countries can thrive. So it's still so very colonial, isn't it? The West raping African countries. It's disgraceful.
Well, we'll see how it'll be interesting to hear Alison Thulis and Stuart MacDonald talk on this resolution, and it'll be interesting to see how it ignites the Hall and how it ignites debate round about this issue that has been bedeviling UK politics for probably more than a decade now. Let's change tack a little bit, because the Inverness City branch and the Wester Ross branch have a resolution with regard to what they call a Rural New Entrants Fund, and I was keen to talk to you about that, Maureen. The resolution reads, Conference regrets the lack of opportunity afforded to young people to access housing. Barriers to access make home ownership difficult, exacerbating rural population decline. A steady and constant decline in the general and the working age population has accelerated over the last decade. A progressively ageing population puts pressure on social care in the NHS, and there is a need to encourage new families to these areas and for young people to remain. Conference believes that new entrants can sustain and reinvigorate rural areas, and it is vital to sustain these communities. In addition, research on land use indicates that new entrants and their successors are more likely to bring added prosperity to an area. Conference proposes that a rural new entrants fund be established to support young people to access land or affordable finance for the purchase of land or buildings, addressing land supply and cost issues. Where social housing or self-built homes are proposed, a permanent residence restriction on use and resale would apply. This would include a right to preemption to guarantee that homes remained available for social housing where deemed necessary. So, Maureen, there's in what is a relatively short resolution, there's actually quite a lot in there, impacting not least on migration that we've just been talking about. So, what strikes you in first of all in terms of this resolution from the branches in Inverness City and in Wester Ross?
Yeah, so I'm not sure whether it's trying to concentrate on rural housing or entrance into farming. It's kind of mixed up, or trying to look at both. And I think in talking about this, we need to try and separate it out a bit. So there has been for many years an entrance into farming fund. And the uptake of that wasn't as great as we would have liked. So there are clearly still barriers to that. I think it tended to be land that was perhaps owned by the Crown Estate or other public bodies where there was farmland, that it was in those areas that was taken up, rather than where a farmer was retiring, his own children didn't want to take over the farm, and new entrants could come in there. So I think that needs to be looked at. Maybe it is being, I couldn't see what the up-to-date situation on that is. The other clearly urgent thing that needs to be dealt with here is access to affordable housing, whether that's housing for social rent or housing to buy in rural areas. I mean, it is absolutely dire. I was somewhere in East Lothian yesterday, and just walking around, you could clearly identify the housing that had been bought for holiday lets, and the housing that was second homes. It was absolutely awful to see. And, with all this housing being bought up as second homes or housing to let through Airbnb, whatever, the number of houses reduced, housing availability in areas where people holiday is huge, and it's a real crisis now. And if we're looking to get land where people can self-build, I think that's really good. We've perhaps not done as much on self-build in Scotland that we could have, but access to land to build more social housing is crucial as well. So I think this will be an interesting resolution to listen to.
Thank you, Maureen. And I think probably the final resolution I want to talk to you about is I particularly wanted to talk to you about because you are a former Minister for Mental Health in Scotland. It's a resolution which comes from Andy Stewart, who's the Disabled Members Convener, and others, and it's titled Trauma and Mental Health Services. It begins, Conference notes the link between poverty, trauma, and poor mental health, with some of society's most significant problems, namely substance misuse, high suicide rates, economic activity, increased criminality, homelessness, social isolation, and low attainment levels, among others. Conference commends the work of the Scottish Government in reducing childhood poverty and now calls for an improvement in trauma and mental health services. Conference calls for the Scottish Government to examine increasing the funding and staffing levels for mental health services. Additionally, Conference calls for the Scottish Government to begin the process of introducing a primary diagnostic mental health care service working in the community, with the aim of a mental health practitioner working in every GP practice to provide early diagnosis, preventative, triage, prescribing, and pre-crisis treatment similar to that offered in Switzerland, bringing Scotland more into line with our European neighbours. Now, as I say, Maureen, you have experience as a Minister for Mental Health in our Scottish Government. What do you think of this resolution from Andy Stewart and others?
So I know Andy well, and he's been a great advocate as the disabled members convener. I would say that the Scottish Government is doing a lot of this already. You may recall that I was the first ever dedicated Minister for Mental Health and developed the mental health strategy, which is constantly being updated. I think trauma-informed services is becoming more and more part of the mental health landscape. I think that the government is trying to increase the funding and staffing levels for mental health services. The aim is to have it as 10% of the budget. I think that the health budget, whether there or thereabouts, but it's impossible to increase the numbers working in mental health immediately. It takes years to train counsellors, and I'm a great advocate of peer counsellors, those who have been through trauma and drug abuse and substance misuse, being part of the recovery program for others. So I hope it's an opportunity for the government ministers to say what is being done, and of course you could always do more. I mean, it's already in the strategy that every GP practice should have access to a mental health worker, that should be a mental health worker accessible in every school or every school cluster. You need to make sure that the resources is well used, and just saying there needs to be a mental health worker in every school or every GP practice, as long as there is access to that for every GP practice and every school, it doesn't necessarily mean a dedicated person in that school. That resource may not be used well in every school. So it's having teams of workers available. But I think if I was speaking on this, it's the speed of access, or when a person wants it, that there's something available right there and then, because the next day they might not be so keen on having that help. So it's a very difficult area. I'm always interested to see what is offered in other countries. I haven't looked to see what's offered in Switzerland, but we can always learn and do better. And I hope that these sorts of things come out in this resolution, always with
Thanks.
the patient and the person involved in mind as priority, because everybody needs a different kind of service. Really, it has to be tailored to the person.
Of course. One thing struck me: the resolution calls out the connections between substance misuse, increased criminality, homelessness, among us, and other things. And I wonder, do you think that the imminent pilot of a drug overdose prevention room in Glasgow, and applying a public health approach to the drug death crisis in Scotland, do you think that the component that mental health care and mental health services will be an important part of the operation of that overdose prevention facility, and that it might promote again the importance of mental health care as in addressing significant problems in our society?
Absolutely. It's that wraparound care that we need for every single person. And one of the, I don't want to say selling points, but it is a selling point of having consumption areas is that a person can, um, as I was talking about, in the frame of mind to also find out and know what other services are available, because there are services available. But if you're living on the streets and just waiting for your of how you're going to get your next fix, you're not going to be thinking about these other things. So it's getting that somebody through that door and getting them eventually to think about turning their lives around. And it's the same in GP practices. GPs were always waiting to see what the last thing a person was saying was that was going out the door. And if they were saying, it would be helpful if I had a decent house, or it would be helpful if I had enough money coming into the house. Nowadays, and there's certainly a pilot of that in Aberdeen, and I don't know if it's elsewhere, that each practice has I can't remember the name of their title, but it's somebody to help them with their benefits and see if they're accessing all the money that they can, or see if they need help with accessing better work. So it's the kind of non-medical part of helping people with their health that's really important. And as I say, that it's definitely happening in Aberdeen, but I don't know whether that's been rolled out elsewhere or not. But that's the kind of type of health service, wraparound care that we need for people who need to access more than just speaking to their GP about their health problems.
Thanks, Maureen. That's as always, that's some great insight. Thank you very much. Are you attending conference yourself this weekend?
Yeah, it's just on my doorstep. I couldn't not, could I?
Oh, that's excellent. Well, I hope you enjoy the debates and that it's a positive and constructive conference, as I think it will be, and that and also bringing everyone back together again is a big help in terms of campaigning and organising and moving forward. And of course, remember that Broadcasting Scotland will be present for the whole conference, broadcasting live across the 3 days of conference. So please watch out for our social media and come back and check on Broadcasting Scotland, and you'll see the latest live reporting that we're helping to cover across the conference for the weekend. But I'm afraid otherwise, that's all that we have time for this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland depends on the generosity of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to continue to develop the station, and to make new programmes for you. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. The need to reach our £30,000 target to continue to pay our bills is still pressing. However, the generosity of our supporters has given us a little more time. We've now raised over £18,800 and we are able to continue making programmes for the next few weeks, but our need to raise the remaining £11,200 is still really urgent. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment as a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, thank you very much. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter and Blue Sky at BroadcastScot. Please like and retweet us there. And you can also find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. Now, as I say, Broadcasting Scotland will be back on Sunday, Monday and Tuesday covering the conference from the SNP Party Conference from Aberdeen. So please come back and join us for that. I'd like to say thank you to everyone who's been watching this evening. And of course, I'd like to give a very special thanks to our very special guest for this evening, Maureen Watt. Thanks, Maureen.
Oh, thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland, Maureen. Please, everyone, look after yourselves, and please have a very peaceful weekend. Bye-bye.